and then we'll start with the blessing. We'll go live on Facebook so people could follow along. See if this all works. Technology, it's amazing. Could you imagine us doing this 10 years ago, 5 years ago?
I know.
No. We're lucky we can do it now.
Thank God.
I would be lost without Zoom. I would be very lost.
It's astounding how the pandemic in many cases has brought us closer together.
Yes.
And into learning, for those of us who don't attend learning type sessions and do a lot of physical stuff, this has been an eye opener and a mind opener, because I've been going to classes, to courses, and it's been, I think, a lifesaver, a mind saver. Let's put it that way.
Good. That's great.
The Melton School has wonderful, wonderful courses.
Okay, here we go. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with commandments and commands us to immerse ourselves in learning and instruction, in improving ourselves. In the root of the word Torah is shared by the word for parenting. And so when we involve ourselves in learning and growing and developing, we are involved in the child-parent project, as it were. So, as I said, I titled this talk Overlapping Hatreds, because we've got a lot of that going on. So this is an article from the Washington Post not so long ago called Politics at the Point of a Gun. Conservative armed groups move into politics as backlash builds against protests and stay-at-home orders. And I thought it was interesting. It says, before his political awakening this spring, Peter Diaz lived a quiet life near this leafy liberal bastion at the base of the Puget Sound. He ran a tree trimming service and a business that built office cubicles. He was 37 and had never voted. Now he has formed his own political party and is the leader of American Wolf, a roving band of civilians who have anointed themselves peacekeepers amid months of tense protests over racism and policing. In the name of law and order, members of his informal group have shot paintballs at demonstrators and carry zip ties and bear spray as they look for anti-fascists. Diaz has done quote-unquote recon in Minneapolis and Seattle's autonomous zone and drove his American Wolf mobile home to Mount Rushmore to celebrate Independence Day with President Trump. America's summer of anxiety and rage has swept up men like Diaz in energizing conservatives who are deploying to the front lines of the culture war. Across the country, conservative armed civilians have surged into public view, marching on state houses, challenging Black Lives Matter protests, chasing internet rumors, and bringing the threat of lethal force to local politics. Their emergence has prompted congressional hearings on the surge in anti-government militias and domestic extremism, and has alarmed researchers who track hate groups. Unlike the old image of militiamen as fringe elements motivated by a desire to overthrow the federal government, these groups often rally in defense of the president and see themselves as pro-government allies of law enforcement. We're the silent majority, Diaz said, standing outside his house with a .45 caliber Remington handgun on his belt. It's time to act. Many members of these armed groups consider this pre-election period a defining moment. In the pandemic stay-at-home orders, they see government overreach that restricts their freedoms and harms their businesses. In the months of volatile street protests, they see local authorities who lost the nerve to confront violent agitators. The federal agents clashing with protesters in Oregon are our Portland heroes, Diaz wrote on Facebook last week, not performing illegal arrests, as critics have alleged, but making strategic detentions of high-value targets. Diaz visited Portland, Oregon earlier this month to offer federal agents free beer and homemade medals of valor as a show of his appreciation.
Wow.
Coding civilians have stormed the Michigan Capitol, demanding the state lift coronavirus restrictions, and rushed the battlefield in Gettysburg following a flag-burning hoax. After a member of civilian militia in New Mexico shot and critically injured a man, a prosecutor in Albuquerque earlier this month sued the militia in an attempt to stop it from showing up as a military unit at protests and assuming law enforcement duties. With a hodgepodge of military garb and over-the-counter assault rifles, such self-styled quote-unquote patriots come from a lot of backgrounds, but they are predominantly white and male. They are often veterans who say the mission now is to defend the Constitution and their freedoms they fought for in Iraq and Afghanistan. I never thought that I'd be in the back of a pickup rolling through downtown Olympia with 6 guys heavily locked and loaded, armored out, said Diaz, a former Army reservist. I'm doing something now that's for the greater good cause than myself, and it feels really good. So one of the things that's really, I think, at issue here, and I think I find it concerning, is there is an overlap of a lot of hatred going on here. These are white men, and white men are at the heart of a significant amount of hate groups, and those hate groups are picking on a lot of different people. So for example, the person who shot up, who executed the massacre in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue is identified as a quote unquote self-radicalized person who was, a white male. Similarly, the person who shot up mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. And one of the things who was also identified as self-radicalized. Are these people really self-radicalized? And the issue is, of course, no. They are part of a worldwide white supremacist movement. And white supremacy is an equal opportunity hatred. An intersectionalist would say, the more minority groups I am a part of, the more I experience overlapping difficulties. So as a white Jewish male, I have more privilege than a white Jewish female person, because a woman faces more challenges in our society than a man does. And I can document that in the rabbinate left and right. Right? Pay differential between men and women as rabbis is huge. Treatment differential, respect is enormous. It's horrific. What women rabbis have to undergo in terms of comments to them and disrespect to them is absolutely off the charts. Then add another layer of it between the white Jewish male and the black Jewish male. In a conversation with a colleague of mine who is a born Chabad Jew who happens to be black, who is a rabbi and becoming a rabbi a second time over, when we were talking about the differences, and I said, look, I'm really willing to share my white privilege as best as I can on behalf of you. He said, really? What I'd really like you to do is sit in the driver's seat for me when I'm being pulled over by a cop.
Mm.
Because if we want to talk about differential in treatment in this country, it doesn't matter that we're both Jewish, we're both men, and we're both rabbis. What matters is that
the color of your skin.
That's it. And I've seen that over and over again. And I've seen it, interestingly enough, in my own being stopped by police. So for example, in college, I was stopped speeding. And one of my friends, who happens to be a black man, was in the passenger seat. And it was not my first time being stopped for speeding. And it wasn't my last. And I am notoriously in a hurry. And so what happened? Well, I chatted with the police officer or the state trooper. It was on a road in Vermont, so it was probably a police officer. And my friend in the passenger seat sat there terrified. And this is 1991. It was a long time ago. Update that a couple of years. In 1993, I am on my way to a Havdalah, to a retreat for first year rabbinical students at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College outside of Philadelphia. So we're driving to like a campsite where we're going to do a Saturday worth of activities. And I have a bunch of rabbis in the car with me, not rabbis, rabbinical students, and we're all wearing yarmulkes. And I'm wearing one of those big Bukharan types, right? The funky square ones. And I get pulled over for, I think, not fully stopping at a stop sign. I don't even remember. There are 4 of us in the car. We have funny hats on. And this is, somewhere north of Philadelphia. So it's not in the suburbs. It's actually in the country. 3 police cars call before they come out. And 2 police officers approach the car, one from the driver's side and one from the passenger side, both with their hands on their firearms before they come to me. And again, this is 1993. This is not in the wake of 9/11. This is not in the wake of other extremist Islamist bombings in the 1990s. This is before all of that. And still. So the gradations of bias, of hatred that influences our behavior, multiply and overlap. So a woman who faces sexism also faces racism if she happens to be Black, also faces anti-Semitism if she happens to be Jewish, also faces homophobia if she happens to be LGBTQ.
Or Black.
And then racism as well. All of these things seem to overlap and are connected. So my question that I'm trying to explore today is in a way that doesn't say, I am more oppressed because I am in more minority groups and therefore I have different rights, but rather, where does this come from? How do we have overlapping hatreds? And in this, I'd rather look at the psychology of the hater as opposed to the status of the hated. In other words, we can't blame Jews for anti-Judaism. We have to understand anti-Judaism. We need to look, as we did a couple of weeks ago, at the sources of anti-Semitism in the world. In order to understand racism, we don't look at African-American culture, we have to look at white American culture. In order to understand sexism, we have to look at what sexists think. So, where do these intersect? Where do these overlap? If we look at the stereotypical or profile of the quote unquote self-radicalized white supremacist, who seems to be the type of person who, as I said before, is something of an equal opportunity hater. Somebody who hates Black people, hates Jewish people, hates Muslim people, hates LGBTQ people. What is it about that perspective that allows the overlap between those things? How do they build on each other? And so I'm going to look at 2 theories on this right now. One is insecurity and fear, sort of the psychology that breeds it. And the other is the attractiveness of hierarchy or authoritarianism. Not that hierarchy has to be authoritarian, but hierarchy has, hierarchic thinking has a vulnerability to authoritarian thinking. So if we start with the idea that we started with a while ago with regard to anti-Semitism, that when we define ourselves by people we're not, we put the people that we're defining ourselves by in a box, and makes it easier to do harm to them, right? So the idea behind Christian anti-Semitism is that when Christians self-defined as not Jewish, the people who were Jewish suffered. So there's a blessing that we no longer, that liberal Jews, for example, don't say in our morning blessings, which is basically, thank God I am not a woman.
Really?
Yes.
There's a blessing for that. Oh my goodness.
There is a blessing like that. We don't say that in the Reform movement, in the conservative movement, in the Reconstructionist movements, because we use a different phrase. We use a positive definition. And if we look at sexism in Judaism starts by a lack of understanding, a lack of connection between men and women about how we are different and unique and wonderful, as opposed to how we are different and gross, right? A lot of early thinking that subdivides groups is in the area of the revulsion principle. Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, talks about primitive societies and having a survival skill because of a strong revulsion reaction. Why? Because if something smells bad, it might be poisonous, right? So if something is rotting, it doesn't matter how hungry we are. If our revulsion principle is better than our hunger principle, then we're likely to live longer. So Jonathan Haidt, therefore, transformed that to an organizing principle around social groups. That if we are grossed out by something and we identify it as not us, even if it's not about survival or otherwise, it's a strong instinct in our mindset, because our minds were evolved long before our current social setting. And therefore, if we give into that revulsion principle, we create an us and them moment. So we can look at sexism in Judaism as, to some extent, a men's revulsion principle to women's different physiology. Something, hopefully, we've overcome in most segments of Judaism in the last couple of hundred years, to say the least. Now, let's take it to that white supremacist movement. In and among the white supremacist thinking is the targeting of the lonely male, the lonely white man. There is an entire subculture among these people that is horrifically anti-woman, horrifically sexist, violently sexist. And we can point at all the cultural corollaries around it, but at the heart of it is frustrated men feeling like they are alone and that women are standing in the way of them being successful with women, that it is women's fault that they are frustrated. Yes, Ethel.
You're not, no male child is born with these feelings or sensibilities. So to go back, these feelings and thoughts must develop someplace along the way. And that I think is where if you're talking psychologically, that's where these feelings of loneliness and enmity towards women must begin. And Freud has to come in here someplace.
Well,
I mean, where do they? The little boy doesn't hate his mother, and if he says, "I hate you," I remember being told we don't use that word. We don't say we don't hate. you don't like this, you don't like that, you know, etc. I think we've all said that to our children.
So part of this is a separation between the immediate family setup and the rest of the world. For example, if we look at the families of slave owners, like the family of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was raised in large part by the female slaves in his household. He felt distinctly attached to them. One of the things that we see here is attachment to an individual does not necessarily lead to attachment to that class of people or elevation of that class of people. And, you know, it's the old, I have Black friends argument. Just be, and look, I have participated in this particular difficulty. There was a time where one of the ways I tried to make friends with the people I was working with on justice issues, who happened to be from my minority groups, was to give my I'm a good white person curriculum vitae, right? My resume of why I'm not a racist. And what was in my resume and why I'm not a racist? Well, I have family from multiple backgrounds. I have all these things to my credit that I've done. And the fact of the matter is nobody cares. Nobody cares about all the things I've done in the past to prove that I'm not a racist. The question is, first of all, because there's no such thing really as not a racist or a racist. We're all participants in a system of racism. We are all at any given moment either participating in upholding or allowing a system to persist that oppresses people, or we are arguing with that system and trying to create a system with better policies that creates equity. And that's it. So at any given moment, I may be acting or thinking or speaking in a racist way, or I may be acting or thinking or speaking in an anti-racist way. Or we can broaden it. I may be acting or thinking in a way that promotes equity and equality among all people, or maybe I may be acting or thinking in a way that allows inequality to persist among all people. And that's a tall order. What we're asking for is a huge effort to say, at this moment, what can I be doing to do better? At this moment, what am I benefiting from that is at the expense of other people? And so back to this not so imaginary, theoretically self-radicalized person, what is this person fearing and longing for? Where is their sense of comfort coming from? And part of it is it goes off of the idea that if we can make a person feel like they are being victimized, then we can help that person blame other people for their state. If I am not getting love because I am a lonely man, it's easy for me to be convinced that the problem is not me, but the people who are not connecting with me. Because it's easy to blame somebody else for my problems. If I am struggling economically and somebody says, well, that's because all of these immigrants are taking your jobs. All of these people who don't look like you are taking your jobs. All of these women who are working and not maintaining a traditional home are taking your jobs. That's an argument that appeals to my insecurity, my weakness, my challenge. And that argument is easily made. It's a shortcut to saying there's a solution out there, and that solution out there doesn't require me to do anything except blame other people and take them down a notch. Why is this a Jewish conversation for me? I see Linda almost thinking that. Why are we talking about this in a Jewish lunch and learn? And the answer is Judaism has always been about finding the answer within ourselves. How do I create a better self? How do I, as a better self, participate in creating a better community? How do I, as a better community member, participate in creating a better country, a better world? What is it that I can do? I want to ask Ethel, why was Freud Jewish? We can say that to a certain extent, Freud was Jewish because Freud believed in the power of the individual to transform ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is a modern idea. Individual agency is identified with the Renaissance. Prior to that, we often think more of a Calvinistic idea, even though Calvin was a Renaissance thinker, of people having their fate tied with their station. Except Judaism has never been that way. Judaism was kind of modern in a pre-modern way, going back to Adina's and my earlier conversation of all ideas started in Judaism, but that's not the case here. There's a real belief in self-growth embedded in our biblical stories even. We can point to other stories throughout the world that are similar to that, like Odysseus. Odysseus is a growing character, but he's not nearly as much of a growing character as his Jewish counterpart, Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph in the Torah is a massively evolving single individual, as his father was before him. Jacob changes, not enough, by the way. Jacob is a story of a partial growth and then a seeking to settle and stop growing.
But he tried.
What?
He tried.
Tried very hard.
Yes.
He got tired out.
Right.
His self-growth is hard.
Right.
And Joseph starts as a brat and ends up as a hero.
Mm-hmm.
That's a significant growth curve. Odysseus, the Greek model for this, accomplishes things, but he doesn't personally change as much as Joseph does. So one can say that we have at the heart of Judaism this ideal that there's more than just, by changing our thoughts, we can change our lives. And that internal-external world connection. However, it's difficult. This is hard work. This is not comfortable to confront a world that doesn't conform to how we think it is to be faced with a number of choices. One choice is, okay, the world has shown me that its reality is different than my internal perception of that reality. I'd better change my perception. Because if I'm coming up against something that is concrete and real and is different than I thought it was, then the concrete real thing is concrete and real. And in order for me to cope with it better, I need to think better and feel better. Not feel better like be made to feel better, but do better feeling. The other options include the world makes me uncomfortable. The reality that I confront is difficult. How can I change it so that I'm more comfortable? Because I'm okay. So in the reality I encounter, I am told that these people are to blame for my discomfort. And look at that concept. These people outside of me are to blame for my discomfort. I don't feel powerful and women are more powerful. So therefore, I am jealous of women's relative power in this world. I am jealous of people who are not like me and their relative power in this world. And here we see, I think, and I'm theorizing here, this sense of overlapping hatred. That what we're looking at is the psychology of a person who has been convinced that the solution for their issue is in placing other people below them. And there's the hierarchical stuff. Because hierarchy is much more comfortable. If I know the pecking order of all the people with whom I interact, then I can just happily go about my business and know I need to bow and be subservient to this person, and I get to lord it over this other person. And we see this in any number of traditional societies and contemporary societies. A caste system is comfortable. It's not just, but it's comfortable because we know what we're expected to do. A conversation between two people who are sources of the infinite, who are both representatives of the divine image, who both are teachers and learners, is much more complicated. I would say it's much more fulfilling, but it's much riskier as well. If I lay myself bare to the four of you on this call today and say, here's what I think, tell me what you think, and I am open to the fact that what you think may not only contradict what I think, but also may transform what I think because it actually is better thinking, then I am placing myself very vulnerably before you. In so doing, though, I am also honoring all of you as we do in Judaism, as reflections of infinite value, as emissaries of the divine. And when I do that, I accept that I don't know everything. And boy, is that uncomfortable.
Why is that uncomfortable? That's what you're here for, to learn, to keep going, to keep learning.
Yes.
If you stop and think you already know everything, there's nothing else for me to know, life is over. That's just my opinion. That's my opinion.
Your opinion, Ethel. That's a Jewish opinion.
Oh,
That's absolutely where we stand in the Jewish world opinion. That's the world is out there, and if I knew it all, it would be much smaller. If the world fit into my head, I would be God.
yes, yes. Yeah.
Not God.
Right.
So I have to cope with my discomfort at not knowing everything and view it, Ethel, as you just did, as not a discomfort, but an opportunity, an adventure.
Right.
And this is why the overlapping hatred concept in my mind is something that we have at least a Jewish answer to, which is we need to work with people who disagree with us, even those who hold what we would identify as abominable perspectives, and accept that they are being exploited for their fears.
Mhm.
And their fears are being used to establish a false system of authority that makes them feel more comfortable, and a false answer to their insecurities that makes them violent. And this is a troubling thing to confront.
The tall order.
Well, it's the central mission of the Anti-Defamation League, is to figure out how to do this. One of the ways that we've been doing this is a number of groups have been funding online responses to these groups. So the ADL and a number of other things are funding Fighting Hate from Home, how we can in fact undercut hate groups at their core, at their recruitment areas online.
It seems to me that if you were able to change the feeling of vulnerability, which is uncomfortable for some people, into the opportunity idiom, it would be a good thing, because you can't, I think it's awfully hard to change people in their thinking. It would be, if you know what I'm trying to say, you're saying vulnerability makes you feel so uncomfortable. That comes from someplace.
Yes, without a doubt. And one of the things, so the complexity of raising and instructing our children, right? I mentioned parenting at the outset of this, being a learner and a parent, and a learner and a child, because while not all of us are parents, all of us are children of parents, and therefore children of the world. We can empower our children with both agency to think that they have a right to demand things, and a sense of awe and adventure in the unknown. American culture over the last, I would say, 50 years has systematically dismantled the excellence of education as a philosophy, as a policy. American culture is fiercely individualist. We are so individualist at this point that one can make an argument that if the government asks me to do anything for the public good, that is an imposition on my freedom. That's not the citizenship of the United States definition of freedom. Freedom is inherently constrained because we are, first and foremost, a country of laws. And the point of laws is to curtail freedom. And the point of government and politics is to bring the community together to form a system whereby our curtailed freedoms create benefits for everyone.
Right.
I am not free to drive the wrong way on an interstate.
Right.
Why not? Well, first of all, it's incredibly stupid and dangerous. But second of all, because the whole point is that my freedom needs to be channeled into going in the same direction as everybody when I'm trying to go west, and going in the same direction as everybody when I'm trying to go east, because then I am free to get a speeding ticket going faster than normal and not free to crash into everybody going in the opposite direction. And suddenly, though, we have, I would say, been infected by a hyper-individualism bug that says, if I don't like to do something, I don't have to do it because I'm free. If I don't want to do something, I don't have to do it because I'm free. And my freedom is a greater value than the health and safety of my community or myself. Now, okay, I am free to do any number of risky things. I'm free to go skydiving. I have chosen, despite the fact that I might enjoy such an activity, not to do so because I value my role in my household and my continued existence in my household much more. And even though it might be a risk that I'd be willing to take if I were alone, it's not a risk that I'm willing to impose on my family. because I'm part of something bigger than I am. So no one's telling me I can't go skydiving. I've made the decision not to go skydiving. I have self-curtailed my freedom. How is that different from the New York State requirement, for example, that we all need to wear masks?
Rabbi, excuse me.
Please.
Sorry, don't get me started. But I was just going to mention that. It's like, there was such a debate. I was in a store yesterday where everyone was wearing masks and a woman had a mask on, but it was under her chin. And, you know, I don't want to be the mask police, but I admit once in a while I just get angry because I have lost 2 family members to COVID and it's very real to me. And I'll politely say, oh, your mask is not on. And I would, believe me, I sometimes should keep my mouth shut, but it's what you talk about. It's individualism where people just, you know, and of course she had no interest in putting her mask back on versus the greater good in the community. And I struggle so much with that. And what are, anyhow, all right, that's my 2 cents.
No, and that's valid. Ethel, did you want to say something? You're muted, Ethel.
I agree with what she said.
So how is this connected to our original issue? And I think part of it is, again, at this sort of heart of, don't make me feel uncomfortable. And I am free to pursue whatever ends I think will alleviate my discomfort without forcing me to change on the inside. Now, Linda, you just made the absolutely clear argument for enlightened self-interest. I don't wear a mask solely for my own safety. I wear a mask for everyone's safety, which includes my own. And if everyone is safer, then our society is better for me in the short term, medium term, and long term. I changed the way where I run. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, I live in a household with somebody who is immunocompromised. So I am going to do everything I can to limit exposure. And from what little we know about this horrendously nasty little virus, we do know that less exposure is better, that it's almost impossible to eliminate exposure, but it is the amount of exposure that determines whether or not one develops symptoms of the problem. So at some point or another, it's likely that all of us will have been exposed to a little bit of the coronavirus. The question is whether or not we have enough to make us be carriers of the illness. So my regular run is in Delaware Park and around White Lake. And when I'm running, I am breathing a lot harder than when I'm walking. Okay. And while I try to wear a mask whenever I come come close to everybody while running, it's not always possible. It's a lot easier for me to wear a mask all the time when I'm cycling, for example, because I'm not breathing as hard most of the time. So I stopped running in Delaware Park in March because it was quite clear there were too many people congregating too close to each other and not wearing masks. And I've checked in on this situation a number of times since then. What I've seen, so like I sometimes bike to nearby meetings. So I get on my bicycle for a light bike ride, I put on a mask, and I ride through the park, because at least my exposure is limited than if I'm wearing a mask and I can avoid people. People are not careful in Delaware Park, exercising and walking. There are some people who are masked and there are some people who are not. So I'm good about this particular decision for my own safety and for the safety of my household. Furthermore, let's go one step further back to the question of overlapping vulnerabilities and overlapping hatreds. All of you, I think, have met me in person. And while I may have some degree of presence, I am not a looming, intimidating figure. I am only 5'3". And at 5'3", I know my limitations physically. And I know that some people might consider me a target if they had less than good intentions. Nonetheless, that has not stopped me from running outside or cycling outside in pretty much every place I've ever lived. For a year and a half living in Jerusalem, I used to ride my bicycle back and forth to Hebrew University through East Jerusalem, through the Arab section of town, without any problems. So I'm not an unbold person when it comes to this. And again, I'm not exactly going to physically frighten anybody who is interested in doing me harm. However, at the beginning, in March and April, I talked to an African-American friend of mine who is a much taller, much more impressive physical specimen, as it were, who has said in the wake of the Ahmaud Arbery murder in Georgia, that he is not exercising outside at all anymore here in Western New York because he does not feel safe.
Wow.
So here is, again, back to this idea of each of these things overlap. I'm making decisions based on illness and safety and the pandemic and coronavirus in my household. And merely because I am white, forget the Jewish part, I am not making safety decisions about the safety of my life based on the hatred around me. Would I be making those decisions differently in different places? Sure. I wouldn't run or bicycle, for example, through Bethlehem or through Hebron in areas where it is quite clear that the tension between people who are obviously Jewish and people who are obviously not Jewish is from other backgrounds who are Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims is much greater. In fact, I once got in trouble because I was on a tour of Hebron with Ginny. This was 1997, and a couple of rabbinical students and myself, and we'd managed to get in touch with an Arab tour guide who was going to take us through the Arab tour through the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right, where Abraham and Sarah are supposedly buried. And this was only a couple of years after the Baruch Goldstein incident in that area. And there was, and I think there still is, a Jewish and a Muslim and an everybody but Jews access to that holy site. And the Jewish side is much less interesting because it is not the central room. And we walked up to the everybody but Jews side, and none of us were wearing yarmulkes. We were undercover, and of course I blew it because I spoke Hebrew with the guard as we were going into the entrance and doing the security check. And he said, "Oh, so you're Jewish?" I said, "Yeah," and of course that was that. And so we were kicked out, and we all had to go into the other side. Security and safety are incredibly relative. As a white man, I don't have to admit my Judaism. And therefore, I get access to a whole host of privileges based on the white supremacy inherent in American society. I take off my yarmulke, nobody knows I'm Jewish. I mean, in Western New York, everybody still recognizes me anyway because it's a small town. So, but as they did in Carson City and as they did in Charlotte too, which was also a relatively small town. And I don't think everybody recognizes me in New York City, thank God. But in the rest of the world, if you're a prominent person in town, you know a lot of people. And being able to be anonymous is a big deal. one of the things that I think another level of this overlapping stuff is all of us with Jewish backgrounds at some point or another, if we've been in a conversation with people about what's going on in the world, at some point we've been called unreasonably to defend the actions of Israel. How can the Israelis do this? If we are women, I imagine at some point or another, we might have been called to defend the actions of a female public figure. How can you support such and such a person? Why does this woman do that? If we are Black, we are often called to represent the entirety of African American culture on a position on a public figure or a public statement made by a public figure, as if that person is my responsibility as a fellow person who might share some background with that person. In thinking about this conversation, when does an American white man have to defend their subgroup? For example, no one goes up to a random white man on the street and say, how come all of you people are shooting up synagogues and mosques and churches? Mm-hmm. Isn't that your responsibility as a white man? Except if the white man goes out of the country. If we are Americans in France or Germany or Japan or China or India, suddenly we are ambassadors. Suddenly somebody might say, I can't believe Americans do this thing, and we would have to answer for it. Think about that in the overlapping intolerance issue. What we have done, therefore, in this country is we make everyone who is not a white man feel like we are foreigners in the place that is our home. Because if I am called to represent all of Judaism, which I embrace, right? As a rabbi, I stand up there and I say, I'm Jewish, ask me questions. But it's an option for me. I don't have to. So it's a privilege, it's a luxury. But for a Black person, for a woman, for an out and proud gay or trans or lesbian or bisexual person, they are placed in the role of being ambassadors as if this were not their country all the time. And that is certainly not fair. Any other questions or thoughts?
It's me again. I have a lot of questions and thoughts, but I do want to say one thing. I was late because I looked on the website and it says Lunch and Learn is now at noon. So I'm like, did they switch it? So I just wanted to bring
I'll have it corrected.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then the other thing I was thinking is, I know myself, it's, you know, I think I'm aware and I try to be aware and of my own prejudice and trying to educate myself. But sometimes it's like when my son came out as gay, okay, all of a sudden I became very involved with LGBT and marriage equality issues. It's like, that was my thing. And, you know, it's when things affect me personally, but otherwise it's like, am I just sitting back because nothing is affecting me personally now? Black Lives Matters. It's like, I think I should do something, but it's not affecting me personally. And what can I be doing? So you had mentioned something about doing something from home, but it's like, am I at fault because I don't have an awareness, and then I feel guilty because I don't have an awareness? Anyhow, just my thoughts.
Guilt is not a helpful feeling if we can't immediately turn it into action.
Yeah.
And So in the comments section on the conversation I had last week with Reverend Denise Walden, there are a bunch of websites. If you want to look at some of those websites, voicebuffalo.org here in town, faithinaction.org nationally. And Linda, if you want, I can probably put them all in the chat. There are so many things that we could be doing. And part of the challenge is figuring out which of those are going to be most helpful. And it's going to take some time for us to get there. The nature of our society is that there's a lot of stuff going on, and we are often made to feel powerless in the face of it all. We are made to feel like there's nothing we can do about it. Powerlessness is, in fact, an ideological perspective. People who are promoting the fact that we can't do anything about something are promoting passivity in the face of difficulty. And there are so many ways to do things. There are so many things that we might be able to do. And I think we have a lot that we can do. This conversation itself is a big deal. And sharing resources with each other so that we can make a difference is a big deal. And going out and marching is a big deal. And asking the right questions is a big deal. But in the ways in which I am trying to be a good parent as well, we need to do forward thinking. When I offer corrections to Jude, our 13-year-old, he often will go and start apologizing. And my response to that is often, hey, I appreciate the apology. Let's go forward. Let's figure out how to do better next time and not worry about whether or not it happened the right way this last time. We don't need the extra burden of the guilt. And with that, I'm going to say happy Wednesday, everybody. Please stay. Today is the 15th of Av. It is a Jewish celebration of love and community. And I am blessed and honored to be with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Everybody.
Have a great day.
You too.